he instigated against King Richard's life. Not that he pursued the Prince of Scotland and myself in the desert, reducing us to save our lives by the speed of our horses. Not that he had stirred up the Maronites to attack us upon this very occasion, had I not brought so unexpectedly so many Arabs as rendered the scheme abortive. Not for any or all of these crimes does he now lie there, although each were deserving such a doom, but because, scarce half an hour ere he polluted our presence, as the simoon empoisons the atmosphere, he poignarded his comrade and accomplice, Conrad of Montserrat, lest he should confess the infamous plots in which they had both been engaged." "How, Conrad murdered? And by the Grand Master, his sponsor and most intimate friend?" exclaimed Richard. "Noble Soldan, I would not doubt thee, yet this must be proved, otherwise—" "There stands the evidence," said Saladin, pointing to the terrified dwarf. "Allah, who sends the firefly to illuminate the night season, can discover secret crimes by the most contemptible means." The Soldan proceeded to tell the dwarf's story, which amounted to this. In his foolish curiosity, or, as he partly confessed, with some thoughts of pilfering, Nectabanus had strayed into the tent of Conrad, which had been deserted by his attendants, some of whom had left the encampment to carry the news of his defeat to his brother, and others were availing themselves of the means which Saladin had supplied for revelling. The wounded man slept under the influence of Saladin's wonderful talisman, so that the dwarf had opportunity to pry about at pleasure until he was frightened into concealment by the sound of a heavy step. He sulked behind a curtain, yet could see the motions and hear the words of the Grand Master who entered, and carefully secured the covering of the pavilion behind him. His victim started from sleep, and it would appear that he instantly suspected the purpose of his old associate, for it was in a tone of alarm that he demanded wherefore he disturbed him. "I come to confess and to absolve thee," answered the Grand Master. Of their further speech the terrified dwarf remembered little, save that Conrad implored the Grand Master not to break a wounded reed, and that the Templar struck him to the heart with a Turkish dagger, with the words "Accipe hoc," words which long afterwards haunted the terrified imagination of the concealed witness. "I verified the tale," said Saladin, "by causing the body to be examined, and I made this unhappy being, whom Allah hath made discoverer of the crimes, repeat in your presence the words which the murderer spoke, and you yourself saw the effect which they produced upon his conscience." The Soldan paused, and the King of England broke silence. "If this be true, as I doubt not, we have witnessed a great act of justice, though it bore a different aspect. But wherefore in this presence? Wherefore with thine own hands?" "I had designed otherwise," said Saladin, "but had I not hastened his doom, it had been altogether averted, since, if I had permitted him to taste of my cup, as he was about to do, how could I, without incurring the brand of inhospitality, have done him to death as he deserved? Had he murdered my father, and afterwards partaken of my food and my bowl, not a hair of his head could have been injured by me. But enough of him. Let his carcase and his memory be removed from amongst us." The body was carried away, and the marks of the slaughter obliterated or concealed with such ready dexterity as showed that the case was not altogether so uncommon as to paralyse the assistants and officers of Saladin's household. But the Christian princes felt that the scene which they had beheld weighed heavily on their spirits, and although, at the courteous invitation of the Soldan, they assumed their seats at the banquet, yet it was with the silence of doubt and amazement. The spirits of Richard alone surmounted all cause for suspicion or embarrassment, yet he too seemed to ruminate on some proposition, as if he were desirous of making it in the most insinuating and acceptable manner which was possible. At length he drank off a large bowl of wine, and, addressing the Soldan, desired to know whether it was not true that he had honoured the Earl of Huntingdon with a personal encounter. Saladin answered with a smile that he had proved his horse and his weapons with the heir of Scotland, as cavaliers are wont to do with each other when they meet in the desert, and modestly added that, though the combat was not entirely decisive, he had not on his part much reason to pride himself in the event. The Scot, on the other hand, disclaimed the arbitrated superiority, and wished to assign it to the Soldan. "Enough of honour thou hast had in the encounter," said Richard, "and I envy thee more for that than for the smiles of Edith Plantagenet, though one of them might reward a bloody day's work. But what say you, noble princes? Is it fitting that such a royal ring of chivalry should break up without something being done for future times to speak of? What is the overthrow and death of a traitor to such a fair garland of honour as is here assembled, and which ought not to part without witnessing something more worthy of their regard? How say you, princely Soldan? What if we two should now, and before this fair company, decide the long contended question for this land of Palestine, and end at once these tedious wars? Yonder are the lists ready, nor can Paynimrie ever hope a better champion than thou. I, unless worthier offers, will lay down my gauntlet in behalf of Christendom, and in all love and honour we will do mortal battle for the possession of Jerusalem." There was a deep pause for the Soldan's answer. His cheek and brow coloured highly, and it was the opinion of many present that he hesitated whether he should accept the challenge. At length he said, "Fighting for the holy city, against those whom we regard as idolaters and worshippers of stocks and stones and graven images, I might confide that Allah would strengthen my arm; or, if I fell beneath the sword of the Melech Ric, I could not pass to paradise by a more glorious death. But Allah has already given Jerusalem to the true believers, and it were tempting the God or the Prophet to peril, upon my own personal strength and skill, that which I hold securely by the superiority of my forces." "If not for Jerusalem, then," said Richard, in the tone of one who would entreat a favour of an intimate friend, "yet for the love of honour, let us run at least 3 courses with grinded lances." "Even this," said Saladin, half smiling at Coeur de Lion's affectionate earnestness for the combat, "even this I may not lawfully do. The master places the shepherd over the flock, not for the shepherd's own sake, but for the sake of the sheep. Had I a son to hold the sceptre when I fell, I might have had the liberty, as I have the will, to brave this bold encounter. But your own scripture saith that when the herdsman is smitten, the sheep are scattered." "Thou hast had all the fortune," said Richard, turning to the Earl of Huntingdon with a sigh. "I would have given the best year in my life for that one half hour beside the diamond of the desert." The chivalrous exchange of Richard awakened the spirits of the assembly, and when at length they arose to depart, Saladin advanced and took Coeur de Lion by the hand. "Noble King of England," he said, "we now part, never to meet again. That your league is dissolved, no more to be reunited, and that your noble forces are far too few to enable you to prosecute your enterprise, is as well known to me as to yourself. I may not yield you up that Jerusalem which you so much desire to hold. It is to us, as to you, a holy city, but whatever other terms Richard demands of Saladin shall be as willingly yielded as yonder fountain yields its water. Ay, and the same should be as frankly afforded by Saladin if Richard stood in the desert with but 2 archers in his train." The next day saw Richard's return to his own camp, and in a short space afterwards the young Earl of Huntingdon was espoused by Edith Plantagenet. The Soldan sent, as a nuptial present on this occasion, the celebrated Talisman. But though many cures were wrought by means of it in Europe, none equalled in success and celebrity those which the Soldan achieved. It is still in existence, having been bequeathed by the Earl of Huntingdon to a brave knight of Scotland, Sir Simon of the Lee, in whose ancient and highly honoured family it is still preserved. And although charmed stones have been dismissed from the modern pharmacopoeia, its virtues are still applied to for stopping blood, and in cases of canine madness. Our story closes here, as the terms on which Richard relinquished his conquests are to be found in every history of the period. End of chapter 28. End of the Talisman by Sir Walter Scott.